Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing a new module. So we are reaching at week 4 and the discussion of our week 4 is policy monitoring. So in this module we'll be discussing what exactly is the policy monitoring, right? And what are the different approaches that a policymaker can adhere for policy monitoring. And finally we'll be discussing what are the measures that the policymakers or other stakeholders can take for effective policy monitoring. Okay. So this is the broad outline of our 4th week module, and today we'll be focusing on what is policy monitoring, right? And majorly we'll be discussing what are the activities related to policy monitoring, what are the steps involved in policy monitoring, and finally what are the major functions of monitoring. Okay. So all of us are acquainted with what is monitoring. In many common parlances, we are using this word, the concept monitoring, right? So what exactly is it? Monitoring is, in a common parlance, monitoring is all about how the things are going on, right? And we need to observe the process, right? Take a note of the processes, right? And when you are observing and taking a note, making an account of detailed account, so that becomes the monitoring of a particular thing. Okay. So this is what we find in general parlance. We are using the term monitoring. But coming to the context of policy monitoring, so how this monitoring in policy context is being defined, so that is what we will be discussing today, following what are the steps and activities involved in policy monitoring. Okay. So what exactly would be policy monitoring? So I would be taking only 2 definitions in order to make you understand that what exactly is this policy monitoring. Okay. So as I told you that in the general meaning, the common meaning of monitoring is that the monitor observes, then collects data and information, right, based on the observation, and then it tries to analyze and interpret the data that is collected. So that becomes policy, that becomes monitoring. Okay. So given this knowledge, we can define the policy monitoring. So I want to quote the definition given by William Dunn. So he remarks that the policy monitoring can be defined as an analytic procedure that produces information on cause and consequences of public policy. So as I told you earlier that this monitoring is nothing but it is a type of analytical procedure. We are trying to analyze the particular policy, right, through our observations, and through our observation we can find that what are the data and information related to that observation on the policy, and by the help of this information we are trying to identify the cause and consequences of the policies. Okay. So that becomes the action of policy monitoring. Okay. So likewise we can take another definition given by R.K. Sapru. So what is this policy monitoring according to him? So he opines that policy monitoring is of course a process of observing the policy implementation progress, right, or policy development we can say. Okay. So the monitor observes the policy implementation, okay, and also observes and identifies and takes a note of it, what is the kind of resource utilization is happening, to what extent resource utilization has happened, and what is the leftover resources. Okay. So all these informations are collected by the monitor, and after that the monitor should be able to identify, based on this observation and data, the monitor should able to identify, or you can say the deviation, anticipating deviation from the expected policy outcomes. Okay. So here 2 things are very clear from the definition of policy monitoring. So what is this policy monitoring? The first one is that it produces relevant information on causes and consequences of public policy, right? And the second thing is that we can also identify, we can also anticipate the deviations from the policy outcomes based on this data that we have already collected, or a monitor has already collected. Okay. So given this understanding of policy monitoring, so now you can find that this policy monitoring is very important in policy process. So if you just recall the policy making processes, right? So we are starting from identification of problem, then agenda setting, then policy formulation, policy legitimation, policy implementation. So after the implementation, right, or in fact during the implementation, the monitoring activities are undertaken. Okay, so in order to know what are the causes and consequences of that particular policy that is implemented, okay, to what extent it has been implemented, right, as per the target, and if you are finding that any kind of deviation as per the target and as per the actual implementation, then we can also identify and find what are the reason behind this or what are the causes behind this deviation. Okay, so we can say that policy monitoring happens during the policy implementation. So this has been a very integral part of policy cycle. Okay, and the second thing is that the policy monitoring is essential because by collecting all this information and data, right, we can improve the policy information and also collaborate among stakeholders, and we can also think about the evaluation techniques that can provide feedback to reframe or revise the policies if at all necessary. Okay, so that is the reason while collecting the information we can also identify if there is any gap, right, and if there is any gap in the policy implementation, right, or in policy there is a gap in the policy target, that means the targeted objective of the policy is something else, okay, and the actual policy that is already achieved is something else. So that means we can find out the deviation, right, and if there is a deviation we can find out what are the causes of this deviation and what could be the consequences of the deviation, and if it is required then through feedback we can reframe and revise the existing policy or that said policy. Okay, so that is the reason policy monitoring is very essential in the policy cycle. Okay, so if these informations are found by the policy monitors or policy makers even, so then we can think that the policy makers now will be in a better position or well informed position to take better decision. So we can find that the policy monitoring helps the policy makers or even those who are interested to participate in the policy making processes or those who are the interested actors. So this policy monitoring helps them to examine the process of the creating of the policy and also the implementation part of it, and finally through this information and data it can also be helpful in evaluating the policy effects. Okay, so that is the reason we can find out that the policy monitoring is an essential integral part of the policy cycle. Okay, so if you see the policy monitoring activities, right, then we can think that these activities can be used, policy monitoring activities can be used to collect the data and also analyze the data related to the policy development and implementation of specific policies, and it can also help to link policy to specific outcomes, and when you are linking policies to specific outcomes, so it also helps us to identify and evaluate the policy impacts. Okay, so that is the reason the policy monitoring is very essential. Okay, so given this understanding, now we can move to understand that what are the kind of activities that is generally required for policy monitoring. Assume that you are a policy monitor, right, of any specific development policy or welfare related policy, then what are the general activities that is required for policy monitoring. Okay, so I believe that this for policy monitoring exercises, since it is a process, it comprises of a lot of activities, and something like we can start like for policy monitoring we require to describe we need to gather the data, right. So for gathering or collecting the data, we need to describe and analyze the development and implementation of policy, to what extent the said policies has been already implemented, what is the development of that particular policy. So for describing these, the relevant data and information needs to be collected. Okay, so this is to start with, we can have these activities for policy monitoring. Okay, And once we have this data, right, data on the policy development and policy implementations, right, so that we can describe the policy development and policy process in a right way or adequately, and accordingly we can analyze them. By through this description and analysis, we can identify what are the potential gaps in the policy implementation process, right. So the identification of potential gaps in the policy implementation process is also one of the very important activities in the policy monitoring. Okay. So then you can think about some other activities, that if there is some gaps, so we should be also able to identify what are the areas where improvement is needed and what kind of improvement is needed. Okay. So identifying the locations, right, where the improvement is needed and what kind of improvement is needed can be identified. So that means one of the activities in the policy monitoring process is outlining the areas for improvement, right, and so that we can think about the implementers. Okay. So given this understanding that these are the activities that should be involved by the policy monitors. Okay. So once that is done, all these activities are done, then we can think that the implementers should be accountable for all these activities. So that means holding the policy implementers accounting for the range of activities that we are discussing right now. Okay. However, what we are thinking is that these activities should be in a sequence. Okay. So for understanding that, we need to understand what are the steps in policy monitoring. What are the steps in policy monitoring? So we will be discussing what are the sequence wise activities are required for the policy monitoring processes. Okay. So first of all, we need to understand that what are the broad steps that is required in the policy monitoring. Okay. So the first step in policy monitoring is identifying the policy boundary, right. So what is the meaning of identifying the policy boundary? So for monitoring, we need to understand the scope of the policies and also the targets of the policies. Okay. And what are the likely consequences of the policies, right, and also that what are the specific inputs or tools that are required in this particular situation where the policy is going to be implemented, and who are the targeted audience or who are the targeted stakeholders or beneficiaries where this particular policy is going to be implemented or has already implemented, okay, or the implementation is on progress. Okay. For policy monitoring, the first step, that is the region, is to identify the policy boundary. So it defines and also establishes the boundaries of the policy program. Okay. And as a monitor, you can identify the specific inputs that is required for policy monitoring, right, and what are the processes, outputs, or again the outputs, the nature of the outputs like intended and the nature of the outcomes like intended outcomes or unintended outcomes, and also impacts. Okay. So everything should be detailed here. Okay. And when I say that outcomes, right, and intended and unintended, generally intended outcomes are predicted. Okay. So the policymaker has already predicted that these are the likely outcomes. Okay. But however, some of the outcomes that is realized, right, through this policy implementation, but which is not predicted earlier, or the forecasted which is not forecasted earlier. So that becomes unintended outcomes, which is difficult. But yes, the first thing in the outcomes during this particular stage, that is identifying the policy boundary, we need to have a detailed data on the intended outcomes. Although policy monitors can also think about unintended outcomes, but this at that point of time it may be a difficult task. But however, at the end where the evaluation is already done, then we can think about the unintended outcomes. But many times during the policy implementation also during the progress of the policy implementation also, the policy monitors can also able to identify some kind of unintended outcomes. Okay. So, the second steps in policy monitoring is about the data collection. So, as I have already highlighted, during the activities that are likely to be involved in policy monitoring. So, the majority or most emphasis is given on gathering relevant data on the particular policy, so that we can think about how to have a track on the progress of the policy implementation. Okay. And as a result, through this systematic collection of data, we will be able to track the progress, not only the progress of the policy implementation, but also to what extent the compliance and operations have taken care of. Okay. So, that is the reason we need to also think about what are the specific steps in policy monitoring that is required. Okay. And the other steps, the next steps in policy monitoring is identifying the deviations. In the definitions of policy monitoring also we discussed, once the monitors will be able to gather adequate data on different fronts, right, as per the scope. So, after that we should be able to identify the deviations. So, that means the data collected is now compared against the initially established targets, okay, and goals of the policy. Okay. And if after comparison, if the monitors identify that there is a gap, okay, then we should be able to identify those gap or those deviations. Okay. And those deviations and those gaps should be flagged off, so that the policy monitors would be able to inform the decision makers that what is the kind of deviations or delays or unintended consequences are happening, right, in comparison to the expected results. So, as a result, what will be happening? The policy makers will be taking into account the policy change, right, as per the information that is already provided by the policy monitors. Okay. So, this is known as the evidence based policy making. That means, after collecting the data, right, the monitors help the policy makers, okay, to take adequate steps, so that these deviations can be squeezed or deviations should not be repeated after incorporating the feedbacks or taking adequate steps. Okay. Then the last step in the policy monitoring is explaining the outcomes. Okay. So, what is the meaning of explaining outcomes? So, here we identified the deviations or gaps. Okay. So, during this monitoring stage, once the monitors identify some deviations or delays, or you can say unintended consequences, right, in comparison to the expected results, then the policy monitors should able to explain that what are the reason behind these deviations. Okay. So, majorly in the step of explaining outcomes, the monitors should be able to explain why at all any deviations occurred. Okay. So, that would be helpful in determining if there is any discrepancy. Okay. And if there is any discrepancy, then what are the reason behind these discrepancies? Whether the discrepancies are due to the poor policy design, whether the discrepancies between the expected outcome and the actual outcome, right. So, this is what we have already collected, right. Data on these have already been collected during this identifications of deviations. So, we can take care that what is the reason behind these discrepancies and what are the causes behind it, that whether the causes are the poor policy design or whether it is because of inadequate funding this discrepancy has happened, or whether it is because of some external factors like your socio-economic factors which impacted for this deviation or gap. Okay. So, broadly these are the four definite sequence wise steps that the monitors used to take while monitoring a policy, plan or a program. Okay. So, given this understanding, now I will be giving a very broad understanding about very two confusing words, and many times these two confusing words are taken together. So, the first one is monitoring, that we have already explained, and the second one is evaluation. But however, this policy monitoring and evaluations are taken together. Okay. But strictly the focus of the monitoring is something different and the focus of the evaluation is something different, although both of them supplement. Okay. So, in order to understand the focus of monitoring and evaluation and what are the differences between this monitoring and evaluation, we can think about the entire policy cycle. Okay. So, in the entire policy cycle, if you can recall, we start with identification of the problem, okay, then agenda setting, right. So, after agenda setting, this is policy formulation. So, in this policy formulation, all the goals and specific objectives of the policy has already been delineated, right. So, after this we need to, after policy formulation, we need to legitimization of policy, right. Okay. So, that means during this policy formulation, it has already been delineated that what are the goals, right. What are the broad objectives, that is goals, and what are the specific objectives, that is our objectives. Okay. So, if you see this policy cycle, then goals, objectives, okay. So, for achieving these objectives, we are requiring a set of activities or inputs, okay, and as a result in the short run, right, because there are inputs are given, then through processes it will produce outputs, okay, and finally after some point of time it will be giving us the results, right. So, it is in terms of outcomes and the impacts, okay. So, given this understanding, and we also know what is the difference between the outputs and outcomes, right. So, this is a very short run result, okay, but here this result is ranging between medium to long term and impact is long term, which is not only numerical or quantitative but also qualitative in nature, okay, and it is the long term consequences of a said policy. Okay. So, given this understanding of all these 6 components of the policy cycle, now we will be thinking about what is the role of monitoring, where is it applied, and what is the role of evaluation, where is it applied in the policy cycle. Okay. So, as it very distinctly displayed in this graph, that the focus of monitoring is during the implementation. Okay. So, that means implementation is on progress, policy implementation is on progress, okay, and that is the reason there is a requirement to monitor the policy implementation. So, what would be the focus then? The focus would be that what are the inputs or what kind of activities, right, are undertaken for this policy implementation and what are the outputs that is produced because of our activities. Okay. So, these two things are monitored over here, and that is the reason the focus of the monitoring is concentrating on these. Okay. And again, as you can see that policy monitoring also spreads beyond this output. That means you can think about that policy monitoring can also happen during the very initial phase of the outcomes. Okay. So, as a result, you can think about that what are the components of the monitoring or what is the major focus of policy monitoring, that is activities or inputs and also outputs, and we are taking into account some period from the outcomes component. But if you see the policy evaluation, then the focus is only outcomes and impacts, not outputs and activities, and in this way you can find out difference between the policy monitoring and policy evaluation. Okay. So, given this understanding, now we can discuss about the major functions of policy monitoring. Okay. So, by doing all these exercises, what you can say, what kind of functions are required for policy monitoring, why at all we should go for policy monitoring. Okay. So, the first point, the first function of policy monitoring is compliance, right. So, what is the meaning of compliance before understanding that what exactly is done in this monitoring stage, right. So, we need to understand the meaning of compliance as well. Okay. So, what is this compliance? So, compliance means to what extent a particular agency, organization or entity is adhering to its internal rules, standards, guidelines and also the external guidelines and the government regulations, okay, related government regulations. So, that is the meaning of compliance, okay. And if you see the compliance, then we can also understand what is the importance of it, okay. So, what is the importance or what is the target of this compliance? Why at all these organizations or activities or agency need to comply with the standards or the regulations and procedures that is already put forth? Because compliance ensures that the day-to-day activities or routine work should align with the mentioned guidelines, so that the policy can maintain efficiency and ethics and also minimize risk. So, that is the reason the policy monitors, they emphasize on the compliance aspect, compliance so far the standards, the standard regulations or standards and procedure that is already set should be followed, okay. So, generally we can find, if you see in a common parlance, again generally we find there are two types of policy compliance. So, what are those? The regulatory compliance, okay. So, if there is a standard regulation, then the agency or the organization must follow it, right, since there is a regulation on it, on that particular activity. And the second type of policy compliance is known as the internal policy compliance, okay. So, internal compliance generally is specific to that particular unit or particular department, right. So, it is a very, it is confined to a subset of the broad organization, okay. So, the first one that we discussed about is the regulatory compliance. So, through regulatory compliance, it tries to ensure the adherence to the external laws mandated by the governing bodies or the government regulations. But whereas for internal compliance, we can think about following a particular agency's or particular organization specific guidelines that I told you, that it may be a very subset of the regulations for a particular unit or a department, okay. So, given this understanding of the compliance, now we can understand what is compliance in the monitoring activities, okay. So, during the monitoring activities also, there are a lot of standards and procedures that are already in place by different agencies or different actors in the policy making. So, those stakeholders could be the legislature, they or regulatory bodies or other professional bodies who have already developed the standards and procedures and regulators and regulations, right, for the specific plan or program or policy, okay. So, the monitoring agency or the monitor verifies whether the program administrators or staffs or other stakeholders are in compliance with the standards that already been put forth by these bodies like legislatures or regulatory bodies or other professional bodies, okay. So, that is the meaning of compliance, to what extent the implementing agencies are adhering to or in compliance with the standards and procedures that is already existing, okay. And the second major functions of monitoring is auditing, okay. Again, before understanding what is the role of auditing in this monitoring activities or as a policy monitor, how auditing is important, right, let us understand what is this auditing, okay. So, for compliance we understood that it is all about the adherence to the existing standards or guidelines or procedures or the regulations. So, likewise in auditing, right, we also highlight some specific activities. What is that? Because once you understand the meaning of auditing, that is a systematic and independent examination of a particular agency's or organization's records. Largely in a common discussion, we emphasize on the financial records, right, or processes or operations, financial records, processes or operations, okay. So, and many times we also hear about auditing, that audit parties or audit group has come to our organization. So, we need to be more careful about the data part basically, okay. So, what is the primary objective of this auditing? The primary objective of auditing is to verify to what extent accurate data is maintained, and so that it can ensure compliance. Okay, so now you can think that how auditing is also linked with compliance, right? So in auditing part we are trying to verify how exactly, how accurately the data is being maintained, and so that it would be ensured for the compliance. Okay, compliance of the laws, the regulations, the existing standards, right? So the main emphasis is about the verification first, right? So during the auditing, two things are highlighted. One is verification and the second one is compliance. Okay. So given this understanding, now we can understand what is this auditing in policy monitoring. Okay. So policy monitoring also helps to determine whether the target groups or the beneficiaries. Okay. So beneficiaries in a particular policy can range from the micro units like your household members and families to states, right? So whether the target groups and beneficiaries in terms of these, right? So these target groups or beneficiary, whether they have been reached through this targeted policy or not. So that means to what extent the allocated resources and services through this policy is reached to the beneficiaries. So that is the objective of monitoring, and monitoring helps the monitors to determine whether the target groups and beneficiaries are receiving the allocated resources and services. Okay. So the essence of this auditing is to check out, for example, whether a state or a country or a region's resources have reached to the grassroots level. Okay. Grassroots level means the targeted areas where the policy is targeting to focus. Okay. And so you can think about some other forms of audits like financial audits or internal audits, external audit or compliance audit. So there are different types of audits that we also used to use, but basically if you see the word audit, if it emphasizes on two broad things, the first one is verification and the second one is the compliance. Okay. So now we can discuss about the third major functions of monitoring, that is accounting. Okay. So what is this accounting? Of course, again many of us have already heard about this word accounting. Okay. And when accounting is coming to our mind, the second thing that is also coming to our mind is record keeping. So accounting is generally perceived as keeping the records or summarizing a particular data, right? So that becomes your accounting. Okay. But systematically we can define this accounting. What is that? Accounting is a systematic process of recording, summarizing, analyzing and also reporting the financial transactions. Okay. So generally we use this accounting in financial transaction context. So that is the reason for financial transaction we have to take a systematic procedure. So accounting is a systematic process of recording, summarizing and analyzing and reporting the financial transactions. Okay. So some of the common example of your accounting could be your flowchart of what? Cash flow statements, that bank account, if you are taking a print of your expenditure and income of your particular bank account, so that is nothing but your cash flow statement. Okay. So the cash flow statement is a kind of accounting as well for a particular person. Okay. So likewise you can think about the income statement, which is bit broader than the cash flow statement. So given this understanding of accounting, now you can find what is this accounting in monitoring. Okay. So we have already understood that the monitors also collects information, relevant information and data. Okay. So information is produced, and when information is produced, it enhances the accounting, right? Because in accounting we are saying that it is nothing but recording of data, then right, through the collection of this data we record the data, then we summarize the data, then we analyze the data and we also report this data, right? So that we can find out what are the outcomes that, or what are the results, the conclusions that we are finding from these reports. Okay. So, in accounting, in this context of policy monitoring, the information is produced, right, and also through this information it enhances the accounting for the social and economic changes that follow the implementation of the public policies and programs over a period of time. Okay. So, that is what is known as the accounting. So, we can take an example to understand what is this accounting in policy monitoring. Okay. So, let us say that we can take any of the policy like education policy. Okay. So, in education policy, let us say that is National Education Policy 2020, okay, and we want to see what are the functions of the monitoring in this case, okay, and we are discussing what is this accounting in NEP 2020. Okay. So, in accounting, what exactly is emphasized? That information is really relevant and that will be increasing the social economic changes. Okay. So, here we will analyze the change in the quality of life, okay, through this education, okay, and to what extent this NEP has already been implemented or implementation is on progress, has already been implemented or implementation in progress. Okay. So, after collecting the data from these, okay, so we are taking the note on that to what extent a particular district has already implemented the NEP, okay, or a particular state has already implemented the policy, right, which states are performing well in front of in the context of NEP 2020. Okay. So, what are the likely results, or by taking a sample also we are generally the monitors, they try to identify that what is the benefit of this, whether the NEP target is already been achieved through this sampled data or through a pilot data like a particular district, right. So, all these are the record of data, right. So, this from this record of data, the monitors analyze the data, right. So, after the implementation of NEP, okay, so to what extent the male students and female students are getting benefited on different parameters or indicators like scholastic, okay, or mechanistic, okay, or literacy, literature or scientific understanding, okay. So, under all these heads, so we can also collect the data for all these heads in order to know the progress of or implementation of the NEP. Okay. So, that is what is known as the accounting of the policy. Okay. So, in William Dunne's book also we can find the example that analyzing change in quality of life that requires looking at the indicators such as average education or percentage of population below poverty line or even type of housing lived in. Okay. So, for analyzing the quality of life, we have to take into account some indicators like education and population below poverty and also the types of housing facilities they are being provided. Okay. So, this when we are maintaining the data, right, related to it, and then we try to analyze it, make a report of it, okay, then try to verify that if there is any deviation between the established target or initial target and the actual implementation. So, that becomes our accounting. Okay. And the last function of monitoring is explanation, right. So, as I told you that during the process of accounting also we can find out what is the gap, and if you are finding the gap, then we should be able to analyze, right. You should be able to analyze that why there is a gap, right, what are the causes of this particular gap or what are the factors that influence the gap, so that through feedbacks we can the policy makers or decision makers can squeeze this gap. That means by making changes in the existing policy, modifying the policy, right, improving the policy, these these gaps can be squeezed. Okay, so that is what is the explanation. Okay, so generally for this explanation, right, monitors used to take different social experiments. Okay, social experiments are nothing but the psychological or sociological research method, right, and through which the researcher observes human behavior, the biases or even the reactions to specific situations, right, and how policy is impacting on the human behavior, biases and reaction to the specific situations. Okay, and basically the social scientists like economists, they are using the social experiments like RCT, that is randomized control trials. So these RCTs are very essential tool for policy makers because it can provide the evidence based policy making. Okay, so the policy makers can also get to know that what are the factors that impact for this deviation that is already identified in the accounting stage. Okay, so once that gap is identified in this stage, will be the policy makers should be in a position to understand what are the causes of this particular gap, right. That means what is the causes behind the success or what is the causes behind the failure of a said policy. So that if it is a success, then the policy decision makers or policy makers, that they can scale off that particular policy based on these social experiments or pilot experiments. Okay, and if we find there is a failure in the policy implementation or policy, then they can rethink about, or they can change the design, policy design, or they can rethink about the policy tools, right. They can think about whether the objectives and targets are rightly set or not. So all these are helpful in explaining, right, or through explanation all these are helpful for the policy monitors. Okay, so we can take other examples like social experiments in criminal justice or education and social welfare that can help us to find out what policies and programs can work the best and how they can work, and if at all they are working or not working, then what is the reason behind it. Okay, so thank you very much. So you can follow this book, William Dunn, Public Policy and Introduction by Pearson Education Limited. Thank you very much.